the third thing is you need to be building an extension strategy. This is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways of frontlining. So when you frontline arguments, you can do it in a couple of different ways that we're going to get into in the next section. One way is to just sit down and be like, here are all the things that I think the neg could say, and here are all my separate responses. But if you're debating and you want to win the round, you don't want to waste your 1AR just like focusing on answering all their arguments for the first time. So what can you do instead of that?
You can stack cards in your face to take out their arguments.
Right. So you want to embed preemptive arguments, rhetoric, and cards in the AC. We'll show you an example of that a little bit later on. The other thing is, and this gets into sort of separate issue that we'll talk about perhaps another time, is you need to actually pre-write extensions in a way that interacts with common neg responses. So, for example, for each piece of offense you provide, you should explain, I know that Mrs. Neal's lab is familiar with this, how you preclude, outweigh, take out, or turn whatever neg arguments you're going to hear. Some might refer to this as pod with two T's. Okay, so let's go to the second section, which is how do you frontline. So just actually before we move to that, is everyone clear on what those terms mean? Does anyone not know? Yes, sir. Preclude, fantastic. Ms. Nealon, would you like to explain preclusion?
Sure. A preclusion means that something cannot happen before your concern happens or in a world. So for instance, if you were to say that fundamentally, I'm trying to think of a good topical example, but all that's coming to mind is framework, so we'll just go with that. So if you were to say that fundamentally people had to have dignity and that respecting that dignity came before all other rights, then you might say that having a deontological side constraint that you not violate that dignity or not violate autonomy at its most basic tenet precludes the notion of having, of like maximizing rights through a utility perspective. Does that kind of make sense? So preclusion means that this concern has to come first, or a concern that that means that the other concerns are not relevant. Anyone else have any questions about the pot? It's not a kettle. That's not what.
Maybe, do you want to just briefly talk about the different terms that outweigh?
Sure. Outweighing means that that something is more important because the impact matters more to the standard. So if I outweigh something, I might say something to the effect of, we're looking at protecting the most rights, and I protect, X amount of lives, and that's greater than just having autonomy roaming free, because those people are still living or whatever. To take out means literally what it sounds like. Does anyone want to give me an example of a takeout?
Maybe like a solvency takeout or something.
What do you mean?
Like basically, so a card that answers if they say like, if you think in the NT they're going to say like, I solved for poverty, so like
Straight and double.
What?
Straight and double.
Okay. What's a double term?
Well, it's not exactly helping you, but it's
No,
still,
it's not. You don't want to do it, right?
yeah.
So, what's a link term? Let's start there. No one has ever heard that term? Besides Madeline? Yes.
It's just when you type the link to the cause and effect, so instead of saying living wage decreases poverty, you're like, no, living wage increases poverty.
So, a link term would be like if the affirmative says living wage decreases poverty and poverty is bad, right? A link term would say, no, living wage does not decrease poverty. Instead, living wage either increases poverty or not having the living wage is better when it comes to poverty, right? But poverty is still bad. So link term changes who gets the impact. What then is an impact term? Yes.
I mean,
How-
okay, it's fine.
No.
In that case, saying like, oh, poverty is actually good. It's not probably a good thing to say.
Yeah, the example, right, it makes us feel kind of weird to say poverty is good, but you've got the right idea. You leave the access to the impact untouched. So you would say the affirmative still decreases poverty, but poverty was a good thing. Also, that is an untrue argument. This is just for the purpose of the example, okay? So what then is a double term? Yes?
Turning both of those things.
You turned both the link and the impact. Good job, but now you lose. Because you just said negative decreases poverty and poverty was a good thing. Oh no, I did something bad. Does anyone have any other questions about that?
Alright, so, the reason we're going through this is when you frontline, you need to be doing these things against the common arguments that you think you're going to hit. And so, we're going to be moving into, I know some people are still getting this down, which is fine, but we're going to be moving into a few different specific ways that you can frontline. Assuming that my computer comes back on. Definitely, the black screen will be out. Oh, here we go. Alright.
Whenever Matt's still my present.
It's just okay.
They just don't.
Okay, so how do you frontline? So here's the first thing I recommend doing, which is card all objections to your position that you find in the literature, the topic literature, both principled and practical. Let me explain what I mean by that. On this topic, there are, and on many topics, there are multiple ways of approaching the issues. On this topic, you could have a more principled approach, which means that we're looking at the overall idea or principle behind each side. So in other words, sort of more philosophically.
Kind of like knows it negatives. Who's familiar with this? No one saw my beatdown? This is unfortunate.
That is highly unfortunate. So, the Nozikian position, do you want to explain that?
Sure. So the Nozikian position on the negative explains that government should not have positive, well, governments do not have positive obligations because they cannot force someone to work for another person's benefit. To do such is a violation of a freedom that they are due. And the example that he gives is, he says it's like slavery. Because if you force me to do work and then I have to give the product of that labor to one of you so that you can live, I have basically worked man hours for you.
must be set up in the fairest and most equal way possible, because we can't control our economic interests. We can't control where we are in society before we're born into it. So he would say that the state must provide for individuals by creating equal institutional arrangements. So I actually, in the rounds that I've heard so far, which have only been in my lab, but I haven't actually heard people take the principled approach, which is highly unfortunate because, in my opinion, these aren't the only principled arguments. There are quite a few others, but people just want to talk about workers in Sri Lanka and then run topicality and then have that debate.
They just want to avoid the classic debate between liberal and conservative values.
Okay, so that's what we mean when we say principle. We mean that it's a more philosophical, possibly deontological approach. A practical approach, though, is often more policy-oriented. So usually this is going to involve things like counterplans, where the neg tries to solve for the app's harms in another manner that's better than the app. So something that avoids the harms of the app. Or maybe they're going to run diss ads. Yesterday I happened to see a round where one person read an app that was about workers with disabilities, and the other person ran a diss ad that talked about how we're going to have nuclear war and extinction. Not really sure how those two things clash, but, you know, such is the national circuit.
On some days.
On some days. So diss ads would be where the neg says affirming creates some big harm that causes a big impact. Now, the point of all this is just to give you the idea that you need to be ready to defend against all of those objections. Even if your app doesn't link to that diss ad, you need to be able to explain why it doesn't link. If your app can't be solved for by their policy counterplan, you need to be able to say why. So whichever approach you take, you can't just discount the other approach because people are still going to try to force that into the round. So when you find objections to your position, you have to card them so that you know how to answer them, which is going to lead us to the second thing, which is write out analytical objections to your position. Meaning, sometimes, although unfortunately it's becoming increasingly rare, but sometimes people just have good logical reasons why your case is a bad idea. For example, what's that? Shock. I know, totally shocked. Let's say that the app says, what's another argument that you all are running on? Some of you might be running on the app besides the poverty argument.
This is that market.
Any app, yeah.
Well, health benefits.
Great, perfect. Okay, so the app is like, living wages lead to health benefits, which leads to, I don't know, like people surviving, whatever, right? It seems like a more practical type of argument. Let's say that you didn't do your prep and you were nagged and you still wanted to make logical objections to this argument. What's one logical objection that you can make? Yeah.
If the living wage actually worked, people wouldn't need health benefits, they could just afford what's going on.
Okay, so one, you could say, this isn't a reason to provide health benefits. If the wage is enough, we should just provide, this assumes that the app is actually saying that, like, people, the living wage involves giving health benefits, but if the wage is enough, we should just provide that and nothing more. What could be a reason why this wouldn't actually solve? Why a living wage might actually be problematic if you're trying to provide health care for everyone? Yeah.
Employers have to raise the cost since they have such a higher living wage, so one thing they decide to cut out is health benefits.
Right. So if employers have to pay higher wages, they're likelier to cut health benefits. which by the way would be what type of answer that we talked about a moment ago, Alan? It's a turn, it's a link turn. Now, would it be better if you had evidence? Absolutely. But even if you don't, those types of objections can be made. So when you're writing the AC, you need to anticipate that the neg is going to be able to make those objections, and then you need to be able to preempt that, which we'll get into momentarily. Ms. Newman, do you want to talk about this?
So, when you're looking at your case, you need to figure out what story is necessary for you to win your offense. Specifically, which pieces of evidence or which links in the chain are important to you being able to get them out. There might be several, well, there should be several answers to this question. If you've written an AC and there is only one route to the ballot, then you have not done a very good job. So you want to sort of diagram out what pieces of evidence sort of go together, all the different routes that you could have to making a ballot story in the end. The reason why you want several is because you never want to be that debater who always goes for the same thing because that's what they're familiar with. You become very predictable. The example I always give is there was a young lady who was a very, very good debater, but she went through the entire Harvard tournament. Mr. Herzig remembers this because he was on the panel.
Yeah.
She went through the entire Harvard tournament with a case that had several pieces of offense, but she really, really liked this one piece. I don't know why. Wasn't even the best piece in my opinion, but she really, really liked it. And so every round, it didn't matter what happened in the round, she was going to go for that piece of offense. So another young lady who was very, very intelligent had seen her do this several times and surmised that that was the only way that she really knew to make a convincing ballot story. So what she did is she read like 7 terms to that one piece of offense, made a couple of responses that weren't that strong to the other offense, and basically just dared the first girl to go for something different. And what do you think happened? She still went for the piece of offense with 7 turns. I was in the back of the room wanting to yell. Mr. Herzig was pulling out his hair. It was terrible.
It was a 5-0 decision for the neg. Yes. This is how to lose in sentence Harvard on a 5-0.
This is how to lose instead of Harvard on a 5-0. But it might have been because she did not do the pre-round work to figure out all of the pieces of offense that she had and how to stack them into different, I don't know, decks, if you will, to win, right?
And just on that, I don't know, how many of you here debated last year? Hopefully most. Okay, looks like just about everyone. Okay, so let's just quickly go through one example of how you could maybe avoid that problem. So the JanFab topic, right? Environmental protection, resource extraction, developing countries. So one thing that you could do, and we'll go through like an actual example a little later on, but let's say that your app, and I don't know, you have the value of justice, and you have a standard of, I don't know, like maximizing rights protection. I'm going through something super generic right now. So you have an argument. Somebody give me like an app argument that they read on that topic. Yep.
Deforestation or any other type of resource extraction causes CO2, and CO2 causes global warming.
Okay. So one argument is about how neg leads to CO2, leads to global warming, leads to death, I presume, right? What keeps happening here? Why does it keep like erasing what I'm doing? Alright, yes they are. Give me one other app argument that people bring. Something not about global warming.
think it may have, I'm not sure if it was warming based extinction, but I think it might have been.
Okay, so these are sort of like practical level, neg leads to death arguments. What's something else you could have run? Yeah.
Environmental protection leads to green jobs, so there's more employment and less poverty.
Okay. So like more, right, more protection, whatever. Now, if this was your entire position, or if this was your entire position, you would be in a lot of trouble because the neg probably had prep on those arguments, probably had like a billion of them, billion terms, parted terms, and probably could flood you out of the round in the 1AR, just like the young lady that we just talked about. So what you would want to do is, and I don't even know that these two arguments are like would fit into the same position. It sounds like they wouldn't. But what you would want to do is have multiple internal warrants. So here, you would need, for example, different environmental harms that come from a rise in CO2, right? So in that case, you only have to win that negating leads to a rise in CO2, but your impact could be something about global warming, could be something else, it could be like a deforestation issue, right? Or you would need different ways that negating causes an increase in CO2. And so if you have multiple warrants for the argument, then that allows you to get out of their responses to one particular warrant. Whereas if it's just a generic argument like this, they could probably flood you. Flooding means just putting out a ton of answers. Similarly, go ahead.
So what Mr. Herzig is saying is that frontlining actually starts when you're writing your cases, right? It starts with an I, especially in the editing process. Maybe you're one of those people that's just got to spit it out the first time, right? But especially in the editing process, it requires an eye toward adding layers in terms of more warrants, more justifications, a variety of arguments that will help you get out, especially if you're the affirmative and you're having to give that nasty little YR, will help you get out of common objections to your position.
Right, because think of it this way. I think the way that Mrs. Nealon described it earlier is really a good way of looking at it. Let's say that you want to walk to school, right? And you could get to school by taking one particular street and walking down that, or you could get to school by going through the woods and getting that way, if you live in a wooded area, or perhaps you could go around some people's houses to get there. All three of those paths will lead you to your destination. So if there's construction going on the street that you would normally walk down, then you can still get to the school by going around somebody's house or going through the woods, right? Think of case writing that way. Don't think of it as one argument leads to one impact. Think of it as one argument leads to multiple impacts for multiple different reasons. Because then you only need to win one link to get to that impact, or maybe two links to get to that impact. But you need to make sure that the case isn't super convoluted. It just needs multiple outs, multiple paths to get you to that end. So, we're going to move to the next thing. Ms. Nealon, do you want to speak about this one?
Sure. The fourth thing is that you're going to want to, especially for empirical claims, write out reasons to prefer your evidence. Does anyone have a guess of what some of those reasons might be? Yes, sir.
On uniqueness, it would be like more recent. I don't know. So like.
Okay, so recency might matter in certain instances. Certainly, if we're talking about something that's likely to happen now, or if a study is a response to a study, that kind of thing. What else? Yes.
An outweighing on impact to the other person.
What do you mean?
Like if their evidence says that 5 million people die, and your evidence says 6 million people die, you go with our evidence because higher impact.
Okay, I think I'm talking more about things about empirical claims that would make one empiric better than another, rather than a comparison of sort of which impact has a greater magnitude. Yes, Madeline?
Methodology.
The methodology, right. So, does everyone understand what the methodology is when we're referring to studies? In the front, in the blue shirt, what's the methodology?
Not sure.
Okay, that's fair. So, the methodology of a study is how the study was conducted. Every study that you ever read should have a section that explains how the study was conducted. And some methodologies are better than others. In fact, usually in your study, your author will explain why they did it this way as opposed to a way that's been done before.
And if I could just add on to that, the studies use should be valid and reliable. I want to just explain. That doesn't just mean they should be good. There are actually specific meanings for each of those. A valid study means that it actually tests what it was designed to test. So for example, let's say I am going to study the intelligence of everyone in this room. The way I'm going to study that is by counting the number of jumping jacks that you all can do. Why would that be an invalid study? Yep.
Because jumping jacks aren't like legitimate measure of intelligence.
Exactly. And yet people often totally overlook what the study is supposed to measure. So you want to make sure that you know, for example, let's say it's a poll, because polls cases are pretty common, especially with certain teams that we may or may not hit every weekend. So polls cases are where they're like, okay, we know that the American public believes that a living wage is a good thing, right? And so then they have all of these polls that they cite that say that, 90% of Americans thought a living wage was a good thing. What do you need to look at when people run a poll? Yeah.
How many people?
Well, yes, that's definitely true. But in terms of just the validity of the poll itself, what do you have to look to? Yeah.
You need to look at the questions that they're asking people.
Yes, sir. You need to look at how the question was worded. Because if the question was, do you think death and poverty that leads to death are bad? Probably 90% or more people would say yes. But if you say, should Americans give up 90% of their paychecks to support the poor, probably a lot of people would say no. So the way the question's worded often determines the validity of the poll or of the question, right? So the study has to be valid. It has to actually be testing what it says it's testing. The other thing is the study needs to be reliable, which means the study can be replicated in other environments. So, for example, if I said I'm going to test how physically active or physically fit teenagers are, right? And I had a bunch of professional athlete or teenagers who were trained to be professional athletes, and I tested them, and I concluded from that sample that teenagers are totally physically fit. That wouldn't be reliable because the setting in which I did that test isn't something that's typical, and probably that conclusion can't be replicated.
Does that make sense to everyone? It's just like a scientific experiment that you would do in science class, right? Your teacher's going to say that your write-up report is not very good if you cannot reproduce the results. So what are some other empirical, some reasons to refer your empirical analysis? I don't know why that was hard to spit out. Yes, Natalie?
How long did they
maybe even the geographic or cultural breadth, right? Who were you studying? You might get different answers depending on where they were from. One thing that Mr. Alston talked to you a lot about in the research lecture that you had was the author qualification, right? We spent a lot of time talking about how it was probably better if you're talking about, I don't know, astrophysics, to have someone who has actual degrees in that field than to find my blog where one time I talked about how Armageddon actually did accurately show how one could slingshot around the moon, right? Mrs. Meelan says Armageddon was the right way to go. It's probably not as strong a claim as Mr. Herzig, PhD in astrophysics, says. Does that make sense? Mr. Herzig actually does have a PhD in astrophysics, by the way. Little known fact.
Little known fact.
We could also talk about the strength of the internal warmth in the argument. Okay, maybe it's just word feature document, because mine just like did this. It's not your words anymore. It's okay. I still know what we're talking about. But we can talk about the strengths of the internal warmth in the argument. We've talked about this, I know, a lot in my lab, because we've been talking about evidence comparison for days and days and days. But who, besides people in my lab, wants to tell me how you would compare the strength of internal warmth? It's a big sentence. What does it mean? Yes?
Would it be like looking at probability change, or like if they have, or are you talking about like in a disad, just looking at how like the link story may like have like small probabilities, but then when you multiply them together get even smaller, or like?
I mean, certainly disads, in my opinion, can be very problematic because of what you've just identified. Not quite the answer I was looking for. I was talking more about comparing internal justifications within like single arguments,
Oh,
instead of
okay.
like extended. Does that make sense? Instead of
Yeah, so
extended
like
chain of-
in a philosophy card, if like they have like a logical fallacy and they try and like lead to a premise within that card, but they don't really support it with any logic.
Sure, or you might say, like if you just want to take sort of a classic util deon thing, right? Where, I don't know, Comiskey says that like it would be treating people unequally if you allowed one to stand in place of the many, right? And then Kahn kind of says, that's not really true. The world is better if we have inviolable status, right? Those kinds of things, where you're actually comparing the justifications for the argument.
Right, so I think there also, it's a good idea to look at, to try to break down whatever the argument is to its smallest components. So, one thing that I really like is cards that have multiple internal warrants, because then it's likelier that the conclusion the author reached is valid or is true. And we'll go through an example of that a little bit later on.
Especially in empirical studies where they can say, I studied this and found the following conclusion, and here are some reasons that I think that conclusion makes sense. Right, so it includes the empirical analysis and it gives some analytical justifications for why that would be reproducible.
Right, and I think what Mrs. Meelan just said is really, really critical. If you want to win an empirics debate and your author has reasons why the conclusion is true and not just statistics or numbers that cite the conclusion, automatically your card is better than a counter card that just has numbers. This is a huge problem that I see in rounds all the time. So Mrs. Meelan gets up and says, living wages decrease poverty in 90% of cases. And I get up and I say, well, living wages led to unemployment in 90% of cases, right? So the judge has absolutely no way to weigh between those cards, and neither of us is going to do it because we're just like, we're too cool for that.
Right.
Because, we're circuit. So
We're
we'll just,
totally, I mean, you have a PhD in astrophysics.
there you go.
And I have a cool blog, apparently. So
It's all working out.
it's all working out for us.
So on the environmental protection topic about how benefits, economic benefits achieved at the expense of people's basic agency and freedom are inherently immoral. I mean, that's a sort of oversimplification of what the case said, but for the intent, for the purpose of this discussion, we can say that, right? The neg, in one particular round, said, resource extraction helps the economy. That's problematic. Why? As a response. Yeah, no?
It kind of links right into his argument.
Exactly. It links into the argument. So the way that he designed the argument, he was saying the more you benefit the economy by hurting the environment, the more you link in. So if the neg gets up and it's like, I link, that's a pretty bad strategy, right? So you don't want to do that. But if you're writing out the argument, you want to anticipate what you think the neg is going to say. Because if you criticize the whole thing that the neg is trying to do, then it makes it much easier for you to win. So why don't we take a look at one example of a case, or a part of a case, that is actually written in a way that's already frontlined. So let's take a look at it. This is on the same topic, environmental protection, resource extraction. This is an app argument that Danny was running. So it says, first, it meaning environmental protection, helps developing states resist physical exploitation, upholding sovereignty, which his standard was about. Understanding the historical imperialism that plagued developing states is key to stopping future sovereignty violations. Dennis O'Neill writes, re-examining imperialism's history helps us better understand the ideological framework that legitimizes, that must be a typo, white supremacy. To create a world where no nation dominates another, we must understand how this domination arose and is perpetuated. Non-European cultures help us conceptualize and create a truly egalitarian society through a moral philosophy of history in which people situate themselves as responsible global actors. Extraction specifically stems from imperialism as the global north initially exploited the south by making it resource dependent. Scott Pegg shows, European colonization of Africa was largely motivated by the desire for raw material extraction. African economies depended on limited exports, which persist in many countries. Mining products were 57% of sub-Saharan Africa's total merchandise exports, but only 13.2% of the world's trade in merchandise. Imperialism still exists as the prospect of extraction-based financial growth keeps the South running on an endless treadmill. They constantly chase wealth, yet always stay in the same place. Simon Henry writes, what keeps rich nations rich and poor nations poor is not bad luck or policies, but the ongoing legacy of colonialism and resource extraction, plunder thinly veiled as trade. Capitalism simultaneously generates underdevelopment in some parts and development in others. Rich states' exploitation of poor states is possible only because the latter's ruling elites gain from it and are complicit at every level, resulting in cycles of repeated exploitation. Further, northern resource appropriation makes it impossible for the South to benefit from extraction and leaves only destruction and death. Carmen Gonzalez shows, the North, with 20% of the world's population, consumes 70% of world energy and 60% of its food, which can only be maintained through appropriating the South's natural resources. Natural resources are finite, and one country's overconsumption requires others' underconsumption. By challenging past and present physical oppression, environmentalism creates new paths to sovereignty. Stephen Vest writes, environmentalism promotes inclusiveness and diversity, letting oppressed groups fight back and prove that environmentalism does not only have a white face. It seeks to build a multiracial movement that views global capitalism as world people's common enemy. Bridging North-South divisions, environmentalism creates global anti-imperialism alliance politics without which social justice can't be realized. Environmentalism works to abolish the very hierarchy whereby humans pursue the deluded goal of mastery and control. Further, he or she can't exclude this impact or framework since traditional moral norms don't apply to the systematically oppressed. Colonialism's victims owe no allegiance to the values used to oppress them since they have no duty to relinquish their sovereignty to others. Brent Fanon writes, the violence which rules over colonies and ceaselessly destroys native social forms will be claimed by natives who decide to embody history in their own person. Colonists view natives as insensible to someone tell me what the conclusion is that he's trying to prove? What's the overall premise of the argument? Yep.
That whenever we have resource extraction, whenever we have countries trying to get more benefits like economy-wise, it's going to be causing imperialism, colonialism, which press down on people.
Okay, so resource extraction inherently, or is inherently imperialist. Okay, and then what are some of the warrants for that argument? Yeah, Madeline?
At the beginning, he gives a little bit of a history, which is helpful because it shows that it's not like a new thing that's been happening for a very long time.
Right, so he would try to use that in and of itself to access the impact, because he would say, we can't divorce actions from their history, we can't divorce actions from the historical legacy. So he starts by saying it's based on a history of oppression. What else does he say? Why else is it imperialist? Like right now, why is it imperialism? This would be in Henry, which begins imperialism still exists. Yeah, Madeline?
Because we're still trading with the global south, it means that we're making them depend on us.
Right. So, I just lost my place, which is highly unfortunate. Okay, right. So he says, the global north must exploit the south to continue the process of resource extraction, right? And that comes from Henry. Then, if you look to Gonzalez, it says that the South can't benefit from resource extraction because the North already overconsumes. Then, his solvency for this is through Best, where he says that environmentalism leads to a new sort of political order where the oppressed can challenge oppression. And then his last thing is the Fanon stuff that says the neg can't exclude these arguments through framework. Okay. So the way this is set up, he could probably access his impacts through any of these individual links, and this last part here is just meant to answer any neg that says that this argument doesn't link to their framework. So this argument is already heavily frontlined. It's written in such a way that he can get out of a lot of neg arguments. So if the neg is like, I decrease poverty through extraction, he's preempted that. If the neg says it's going to lead to nuke war, he's preempted that with the last part about framework. If the neg says countries benefit from resource extraction, he's preempted that. So the point of this is just to give you an idea of what a well-frontlined argument looks like. The other thing that you have, which I don't really want to go into, but we can just kind of scroll through, or actually it's not in this handout, but in the inbox you have that Kantian case. That's a really annoying case that I don't like at all, and he didn't run during the season, but it's a case that he wrote that has front lines to framework in it, so you can just take a look at that later. Why don't we move to the last section, just before we wrap up, which is frontlining on the camp topic. We don't have a huge amount of time right now, but I think one thing we could do is just list out some of the common app arguments and responses, and the neg arguments and responses, so that you can do that as you frontline your own cases. So let's start with sort of common app arguments. What are a lot of people running? Or what are you running? Yes?
It decreases poverty.
Okay. So, arguments about poverty. What else?
Helps the economy.
Okay, what else?
Decreases turnover.
Okay,
Increases worker productivity.
okay. Alright, so that's a decent list. So, how do negs typically respond to these arguments?
Well, they say that it decreases autonomy. Oh wait, never mind.
How do they respond to the poverty arguments?
Unemployment.
Okay. Are there other things, I mean, really, we could actually, instead of doing it individually, seems like there's sort of sets of common neg answers. Or common things that the neg could say would undermine these benefits. So unemployment's one, what else?
They try to turn the economy benefits
Okay, how do they try to do that?
because they say that if employers have to pay more, they fire more, and they fire more workers, and then the businesses aren't doing as much.
Okay, so they could, maybe they're talking about how like businesses favor high-skilled workers over low-skilled. What else might they talk about? If you've been in that other demo round, you would have seen Mrs. Nealon read a whole bunch of these arguments. Yes.
Outsourcing skilled workers, people who are getting the money are in the higher income class, leads to electronic machines who are taking the jobs.
Sure.
Said all that.
So this is, I mean, obviously there are more things that you could say, but this is an example of what you need to do. So you have your arguments, you have their arguments. What you have to do is explain within your own arguments why these harms aren't going to happen or won't matter as much. So you can do that either by writing in, you don't necessarily need to read this in the case, but you can either write in reasons to prefer your evidence, or you can have logical reasons why your arguments are going to outweigh these arguments. I don't think we have time to do the whole thing for the other side, but let's just do maybe one quick example. Let's say that you're doing, I don't know, an argument about worker productivity, right? And you know that they're going to say some of these things. How can you frontline against this? What can you say about why worker productivity comes before neg harms? Yeah, Madeline?
Well, you could say that because the app increases worker productivity, the companies won't have to lay off workers because they're getting more goods for their money.
Excellent. So that seems like it would solve for a lot of the neg arguments. Sure, more productivity leads to more money. Now we have something we can use to take out those arguments. What's another way that you could try to take out those arguments? Through your benefit of productivity or just any of these other benefits? Like let's say the poverty stuff. Why would a decrease in poverty take out or turn back or preclude all these other arguments?
I mean, you could say that like the really common part of it, that like poverty is the worst form of like structural violence.
Yep. So you could say that the app produces structural or systemic harms. What is structural violence?
It's like institutions that are like oppressive towards like specific bodies of people.
Okay. So your argument could be that the economic harms aren't structural or intended, whereas harms to the some situations. You would obviously need evidence to prove that. But yeah, you can make the argument that a systemic harm is much worse than a harm that happens to occur as a result of an increase in living wage. Ms. Neal, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up? Think we're good? Okay, do you guys